and you know we were going to give you a little Mary Tyler Moore. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong wrote a wonderful book, Mary and Lou and Rhonda and Ted. Came out about 5 years ago. It was a New York Times bestseller. It was one of the old. It was just a great book, Simon & Schuster. I'm sure you could find it about the greatness of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And since we're in Minneapolis, we start with Jennifer here as we begin our third hour. Jennifer, it's nice to have you with us. Christopher Russo, how are you today, okay?
Great, thank you.
Nice to have you with us. Nice to have you aboard here. Lot to do here today, and I'm a big Mary Tyler Moore fan. I'm old enough, thank goodness. Let's first start. Why did they pick Minneapolis to base the show on?
Well, it was basically because they didn't want to be in Chicago or in New York or Los Angeles, and they even felt like Chicago was still a little too, done. So they decided to have her be living in Minneapolis. And another thing that they said they really liked about it is that, this way it's this kind of, mid-sized Midwestern town, and it still felt like the big city to somebody like Mary, while it kind of felt like a small town to her best friend Rhoda, who had moved there from New York City.
Interesting. So they're looking for a sort of a mid-market that would play with Valerie Harper, who played Rhoda, and, of course, Mary Tyler Moore, who played Mary. Now, let's do the song, because I just played it, and let's do the intro. She came here, and we have a lot to do with Jennifer, including all the women writers and everything else. She came here in 1970 on a February day, because the show was obviously filmed in Hollywood, in a February day to do the theme song, and they froze to death. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And you really can tell, though, I'm sure people who live in Minneapolis can tell, and the rest of us can tell, too, though, that it's real. It makes it feel like the show is actually set there. It's not kind of like that thing where it feels like it's this fake version of it. Especially with that opening, it just sort of set the scene and showed lots of real life landmarks in Minneapolis that you can still visit today and kind of feel like, oh, this is where Mary walked along the lake. This is the outside of Mary's house that she lived in. All of this stuff. It really kind of helped to make it feel like it actually did happen there. And yes, of course, we all know how cold it gets in Minneapolis.
And then she changed. Right, and then she changed the coat later because she was against the animal thing with the minks, so she changed the coat in subsequent years. Correct?
Yeah, they actually redid the opening a couple of times throughout the series anyway. And one of the big first changes was that she had worn, I want to say it was like a thrift store fur coat in the first go round of that, and then later decided that she did not want to be promoting fur. So they made several changes, and that was one of them.
Now, fair. Number two, the song. I play that song all the time. Matter of fact, Jennifer, you'd be pleased. We do a trivia contest every year to give away tickets to this game, Super Bowl. It's called Super Bowl Trivia. The NFL gives us permission. We ask 1 million questions. We get 30,000 calls. I've done it for 30 years. And this year, because of your book and the fact that Mary died last January 25th, we actually did a Mary Tyler Moore segment where we asked questions about Mary Tyler Moore. And going into that, we obviously started off those questions with the song. The song is one of the great theme songs in the history of television, and it was done a couple different times, written by Sonny Curtis, and he also sang it. Give us a little rundown on that for a sec. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. It's one of these strange little quirks of TV history and things working out right. They were looking for a theme song. Sonny Curtis was a songwriter who kind of just had this vague connection. I want to say somebody, his agent knew somebody's manager who was working on the show or something like that. And he heard that they were looking for this theme song, and all he read was kind of the outline of what the show was supposed to be about. And just kind of dashed off that theme song and went and played it for these guys. And he's this, big kind of cowboy guy. He's very country. He's from West Texas. He used to play with Buddy Holly. And so it didn't seem right at all. That like you would never think this is the guy who'd end up writing the perfect theme song for this landmark show about a single woman in the city, but he just completely nailed it. And I think that, plus what we were just talking about, the filming of the opening credits with the iconic hat toss at the end of it, just all came together in this perfect package.
Now, and obviously he did it a couple different times, because the first year, I think you'll make it, and then after that he had to say he did make it, so he had to do it.
Yes.
And he wanted Andy. They wanted Andy Williams, and he said no. Correct?
That is correct. He said my one request in this whole thing is that if anybody's going to do this theme song, I have to be the one who sings it. And he kind of ended up doing this sort of croonery, version that I think matches what they had hoped for anyway. It's just that he wasn't what they envisioned the person singing this song should look like, but it turned out perfect. And yeah, I love that. I noticed that you played the first version on the opening today, and I was noticing that because it goes from this kind of like tentative, you might just make it, to you're going to make it after all, which is an even better version.
There you go. Yeah, I wanted him to play the second version, but Ray Martell is not as old as you and I am, so he didn't play it properly. Maybe at the end. Let's do Mary before we do the cast and then the writers. We all know that obviously Dick Van Dyke. She sort of plays a mini Lucille Ball in that role. And she does a phenomenal job in the mid-60s, 61 to 66. She's a young actress. She's, had a couple little credits to her name, but that puts her on the map. Then she has a bad 5 years where she doesn't do anything. But she has Grant Tinker. She's got these two great writers in Brooks and Burns who set up the show for her. And, really, CBS gave her a break because they had the Dick Van Dyke Show and she was so successful. But it's weird that she went 5 years in Nowheresville before she got this part, Jennifer. Give us some thoughts on that for a sec.
Yeah, she kind of had one of those strange, it's like a couple of bad decisions, kind of put her in a bad place. She really was kind of supposed to be a big movie star after the Dick Van Dyke Show. And you have to remember that back then, it was sort of cooler to be a movie star than to be a TV star. That's been true until pretty recently. And so that was sort of the ideas. And so she signed a movie contract, and then the studio just put her in a bunch of clunker movies. One of the most famous is called Change of Habit with Elvis Presley. It's a musical, but it's also like he's playing a doctor and she's a nun who falls in love with him, and they're like helping underprivileged children in the city. It's just really not. It's not good.
To say it mildly, yes, bad movie. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not good. It's exactly like it sounds from the setup. It's a little bit too ridiculous. And, there were kind of like a couple bad movies, and she also starred in a musical stage version of Breakfast at Tiffany's that is famous for how badly it did. It just never quite came together. It got incredibly bad reviews and previews and kind of closed before it really opened, and is notorious for having lost incredible amounts of money on Broadway. So that was sort of where she was when she ended up doing a TV special with Dick Van Dyke. And he really kind of almost let her steal the show. If you watch it, like she's just so luminous in this. She's singing and dancing and being funny and beautiful. And it kind of reminded everyone, and CBS, specifically the network, of how wonderful she was. And that's when they approached her and offered her a show. And then she and her husband, Grant Tinker, put the team together that made the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Yeah, that great writer team and everything else. How about the rest of the cast? It's a tremendous ensemble cast. Not really that famous or that good prior to getting put together here. Yeah, Gavin MacLeod did some guest appearances on YF50. Yes, Cloris Leachman did a couple of good movies. But overall, and Valerie Harper worked on Broadway a little bit. But, I mean, for the most part, it wasn't a group that had a ton of success outside of Mary Tyler Moore. And somehow the Lou Grant, Ted Baxter, they find the right guy for each part. Give us some thoughts on that. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the greatest TV casts of all time. And that's usually the key ingredient for when you have a classic. Like, nothing usually becomes a classic without that special magic that happens around having the perfect cast. Yeah, I mean, it's down to a person. Every single person here is just tremendous. And like you said, a lot of them, like Ed Asner and Gavin MacLeod, were both coming from dramatic backgrounds, so no one really thought they were going to be able to do comedy, for instance. So there were a lot of people kind of playing against type and doing things they hadn't done before, and it really just all the magic came together when they were doing this script in this place, and we are so lucky to get to have all of them. And this is also later on, they added people like Betty White to the mix, and she is just tremendous as well.
Yeah, she's still going strong, no question about it. The writing, and this is a big theme of your book, Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted, about the brilliant minds who made Mary Tyler Moore a classic with Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, came out a few years ago. We're in Minneapolis, why not? The writing here and their unbelievable ability, Brooks and Burns, the two big producers of it and writers, to figure out and get a staff of females. And that's a big theme in your book, the woman writer who sort of found her way into Hollywood, and the fact that they found so many young, very talented writers to write about a single woman living in Minneapolis. You needed women writers, and a lot of these great stories that were a part of this show for 7 years is because of the great female writers behind it. A huge theme here for your 250 pages. Go ahead, give me a couple minutes on that.
Yeah, absolutely. This was really the thing that initially interested me. I mean, besides the fact that, of course, I just loved the show, but when I investigated, I found that it was the first show to have multiple women on the television, on the writing staff. And this was not an easy feat at that time because there just weren't that many women writers working, period, in comedy. So they really had to work to find women to staff it. And the reason they did that is because James L. Brooks and Alan Burns, who created the show and ran it, they were very into realism, and they felt like, okay, that's fine, that's great, we wrote a good first script, but we don't know what it's like to be a single woman in the 70s because we are not women. So they kind of really sought out women to fill their staff, and I thought that was really extraordinary. They were just so focused on getting it right that they recruited these women and they mentored them. A lot of the women didn't have a ton of experience before. There were a few. One of the first on the show was Treva Silverman, who was there for several years, and she did have some experience, but that was very rare. And she was definitely like among the best, and she wrote lots of the scripts and was kind of a leader among them. But they really had to walk a lot of these women through learning to write TV scripts because they had previously been they're very talented and they showed promise, but they had been working as, secretaries, and even their first assistant on the show, Pat Nardo, they said, you're so funny when you're helping us with scripts, you should try writing. So she paired up with her best friend from New York City, Gloria Banta, and wrote several scripts as well. And a lot of these women, the important thing here, too, is a lot of these women went on to use that experience and do other things in Hollywood. So several of them went on to work for the Rhoda spinoff show. Gloria actually, several of them went on. Gloria and Pat went on to do that. And, from there became producers and, executives and things like that. So it really did actually have an effect on the industry overall because they were then able to be role models for future, young women entering the industry. So it kind of had this nice ripple effect in addition to it just giving that sense of realism to a lot of the storylines, especially things like the dating storylines, which a lot of them, came directly from these women's lives.
Well, Brady Bunch had 7 women writers, and Mary Tyler Moore had 25. I think that's the stat you gave us, so there's a perfect example. Let's talk about TV in 1970 and, Petticoat Junction, the Beverly Hillbillies, hee-haw. It almost really was much more for rural America than it was for New York and L.A. and the big cities. And then all of a sudden, 170 hits. You have all these important shows historically that go down in history, whether it's MASH, All in the Family, obviously Mary Tyler Moore, then later on Maude. I mean, you had all these unbelievably big shows, The Odd Couple, that really kind of changed the way TV was, because prior to the 70s, it was kind of corny. And then all of a sudden, 1970 hits, and it becomes pretty hip. Let's do that for a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was sort of this famous changeover. They actually called it it's hard to say, rural purge on CBS. They got a new president, and one of his big edicts when he came in was to kind of modernize their lineup. And that's when we get that famous, eventually, CBS lineup of Newhart, Carol Burnett, MASH, All in the Family, and Mary Tyler Moore Show on the same night. Like, it was mind-boggling. People would stay home on Saturday nights to watch hours of television all of a sudden because of these shows. And a huge part of this was actually also that they started to figure out that, advertisers wanted young, wealthy, upwardly mobile professional people to be watching their ads. It just makes sense. They're going to spend more money. So this is when that changeover really starts to happen. And it ends up being, as you noted, pretty good for artistic progress as well on television. It really, makes the focus, instead of things like Green Acres or the Beverly Hillbillies, to be these kind of like progressive, forward-thinking shows that also end up kind of, breaking a lot of barriers that had been there before, showing more stuff that they hadn't shown before, more mature content. A lot of people talked about how the Mary Tyler Moore Show, the reason they loved it is because it felt like it was a sitcom for adults, So even though, you could still have kids in the room at the time. So that was really what started to happen there. And we started to also just kind of, because of that, recognize that TV could be its own art form. And we definitely see that reverberation still today.
It's great about the Mary Tyler, and I was a big All in the Family guy, as I think that's the number one sitcom of all time. I still think that way. I know it kind of limped home at the finish line, which you wrote about, but I do think it's the number one. I know there's Seinfeld, Mary Tyler Moore, MASH, but I think All in the Family is number one. But forgetting that for a second, the thing I was really most impressed with is how Mary Tyler Moore herself, how she had no ego. I mean, she let other people take the extra line. She'd have a guest in there, from a big guest from Walter Cronkite, whoever it might be, and she gave up the center stage. She really wanted to be more a part of an ensemble cast than just be the star. Now, listen, Rhoda went to some success. Phyllis went to some success. Alice Asner was a good dramatic actress, so Lou Grant had a moderate amount of success. But Mary Tyler Moore was the star of the show. Without Mary Tyler Moore, I mean, you wouldn't have a show without her. And she did not play that. She was pretty good about it, of letting everybody shine. And that kind of shows you the person that Mary Tyler Moore was. So give me some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this was something people said to me over and over again when I was researching this book. And it seems like that really had some effect on kind of the way that the cast got along and the way that everybody was able. You talked about how good the cast was. I think part of the reason we know that is because she had this great instinct to let other people shine too. And so many people said, you don't understand, when you're on a show, most of the time the person who is the star kind of insists on being the star. And the best shows are the ones where the star allows the other people to shine in their own moments and show their own strength. So she would often, to many people's surprise, say things like, oh, I think this line is really funny, but it would be funnier if Rhoda said it. She'd do stuff like that. And that really not only let people shine, but also engendered this kind of feeling of trust and camaraderie among the cast, because they didn't feel like, oh, we're just here to support Mary. We're a team, doing this great material. And I feel like that even was reflected in her production company as well, as, all of the shows that they ended up doing in her production company were these sort of, artistic minded, put creativity first kinds of shows. And that ethos is kind of reflected throughout. And, the star always sets the tone for the set, and everybody really appreciated how generous she was.
Right. Now, you have a lot of episodes here. They did 7 years. They do about 23 episodes a year, Jennifer? Is that how many they did?
Yeah.
All right, so that's 146 episodes. I got one of my producers bought me the whole full years for Christmas. So I'm through the first season as we move it along, and I saw these shows in syndication. So I didn't see them necessarily live. I'm 11 years old when it first came out, which still blows me away. The 1970, I was in 5th grade when Mary Tyler Moore began, but it really progressed. And, if you watch that first year and then watch year 5, it's almost a different show. What was the biggest improvement that when you watched? You must have watched this. You watched each show a million times before you wrote this book.
Yes.
What did you notice the biggest improvement that they made as a show between years 1 and year 7?
Well, I think they got bolder. I think at first, it was 1970 when they started, and 1969 when they sort of pitched this to the network. Things were different. And so by the time we're into later seasons, they've got shows like All in the Family on the same night. Like, a lot of TV is racing ahead at this point. So I think they got a lot bolder with, tackling issues of the time. And, they did things like, there's a famous episode where Mary asks for equal pay. She finds out that her predecessor, who was male, made more than she did. When they deal with stuff like that, they get sort of progressive with her dating life. There's another famous episode where she stays out overnight, and we see that. And she mentions that she's on birth control. So I think that was the part that, at least for me, I liked, in the fact that they did it in their own way. They didn't do it in that All in the Family way of, like, All in the Family had a very specific way of tackling issues. They'd kind of like have an issue of the week and wrestle it down, and have a discussion about it. Whereas this show kept its own style, kept its character-driven comedy, but also did the stuff. I love this. There's an arc where Mr. Grant gets divorced from his wife, and they do this wonderful combination of kind of really touching moments with the comedy, and that's where I think they were really special, and they were able to kind of bring all of these different elements together in their own way.
You want to put it top 5 or 6 in the history of sitcoms? Let me hear your order, Jennifer.
Of sitcoms?
Yes, all the time. Comedic. I mean, you got Seinfeld, you got All in the Family. Where does Mary Tyler Moore rank in your eyes?
I mean, it's hard for me to rank them, especially since I also wrote a book about Seinfeld, so I'm like enmeshed in that as well. But I definitely think it's up there for me. It's hard. I like it a little better than All in the Family personally, but that's only on a personal preference level. Like, I would say, I'd put that only one rank above All in the Family. Seinfeld's definitely up there as well. MASH is up there. There's a lot of good ones from then, from now. There's so much good television now too that it's hard. But this one is special, I think, because it was groundbreaking. People hadn't done this stuff before, and you can still see how, if you watch TV now, more modern sitcoms use elements from this show all of the time, and they sort of pioneered, especially, like I was saying, this sort of pathos with comedy where they can easily balance actual feelings with genuinely funny stuff and great acting. So in that sense, it's definitely up there for me because it does all of the things I love.
Excellent thought. Carol O'Connor, All in the Family is almost too much on Carol O'Connor, and this is a little different. Jennifer,
Yeah.
great job. Yeah, great job. Keep up the good work. I enjoyed this book immeasurably. Thanks for a few minutes here today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
You got it. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, of course, on Mary Tyler Moore. Do we have the original? You got the second version now, Ray? Did you find it? Or I know that she said you played the first version of the song. You got the second version?